Story 1. This takes place back when I was in the 6th grade. For science class, each of us had to collect 10 different types of flowers, identify them, and write a report. This was near the end of the year, I think it was in May, so it would actually be pretty easy. However, the experience I had while working on the project was completely terrifying, and you're about to hear why. On the day our teacher told us about the project, I decided to visit a nearby park when I got home to see if I could knock it out. Spoiler alert, I was and still am a pretty big nerd. I even asked my two friends Mary and Maddie if they wanted to come with me, but I think they had other things to do. Anyway, soon after I got home, which was around 4, I threw an empty pencil case, water bottle, and granola bar into my backpack. I put on a hat and sunglasses and started walking to the park, which was only about 3 blocks away. The park itself wasn't that big. It was a neighborhood park, which mostly consisted of a field and a small playscape and picnic tables on the side. The field was occasionally mowed so that it could be used for soccer games, but at that time it hadn't been mowed in a while, so it was completely full of wildflowers. When I got to the field, I found several different species of flowers right away. If I remember right, they were Indian blankets, plains coreopsis, and black-eyed Susans. I made sure to pinch off a few flowers of each type and put them in my pencil case. Right as I was finishing up putting the flowers in the case, I stopped, as I thought I could hear something. It sounded like someone stepped on a plant somewhere in the middle of the field. I instinctively looked at the field, but because some of the grass and flowers were knee-high, I had a hard time seeing things. I assumed it must have been a small animal, and as I was planning to just walk around the perimeter of the field, I figured it wasn't a big deal. So that's what I started to do, and about 5 minutes later I had 2 more types of flowers. But just as I was putting another set of flowers in the case, I thought I heard something again. It sounded like someone took a big step in the grass, but when I looked at the field, I didn't see anything. The sound seemed to come from about 30 feet away, so further into the field. At this point I was growing a bit concerned, as it didn't seem like an animal scurrying away. But since I was on the outside of the field and could easily run back on the sidewalk, I did feel relatively safe. After thinking about it, I decided to go just a little bit further. I figured I'd get 1 more type of flower and then head back. We did have a week to complete the project, and the flowers didn't even have to be wildflowers. For instance, we could just walk around our yards and get flowers from there. But being the nerd that I was, I wanted to have the biggest collection, so I had really wanted to get everything I could from this field. Finally, I saw another type of flower that had small purple petals, and it was just around the next corner of the field. I walked over to it, and like before, I took out my pencil case, pinched a few flowers off, and then put them inside. Then I heard the noise again. This time I looked around more quickly, and what I saw was shocking. About 20 feet inside of the field, I saw a large gray object moving to the ground. It took me a second to process what I was seeing, but I soon realized that it was a person. They were just crouching or lying down in the field. My blood ran cold as I thought about what to do. From the size of them, the person wasn't a kid, and I figured they must have been watching and following me the whole time. I slowly put the pencil case back in my backpack, zipped it up, and put it around my shoulders, trying to play it off like I didn't notice that person. I walked back onto the sidewalk and started walking back the way I came, but to my absolute horror, the person stood up and started walking towards me. He must have either noticed me, noticed him, or noticed that I was leaving. It was a man, in a gray t-shirt and blue jeans. He looked to be in his 30s, and disturbingly, he was smiling. When he stood up, I jumped back a bit, and he made kind of a surprised, laughing gesture, like he was sorry he startled me. When he walked over, he introduced himself as Mark, and observed that I was walking around collecting wildflowers. I didn't know how to respond, and I must have been paralyzed by fear because I didn't immediately run. Mark, or whatever his name was, started walking closer, telling me that he was just out to admire the flowers too, and found some unusual and beautiful ones near the other side of the field. At this point I managed to say something like, no thanks, but Mark kept walking closer, and told me it would only take a moment. He said he'd help me collect the flowers. Now he was only like 10 feet away from me, and I took off running. I looked behind me and almost choked when I saw Mark was running towards me as well. A second later I felt the straps of my backpack dig into my shoulders as Mark grabbed it from behind. I was about to pull my arms out when I felt an arm reach around my chest and grab me tightly. Mark started making a shushing sound and told me not to worry. I bent my chin down and bit his arm as forcefully as I could. Mark screamed and let go immediately, and I think he stumbled backwards. I took off running again, and this time I don't think he followed me. I ran like there was no tomorrow, all the way back to my house without stopping. As the field was almost out of view, I turned around to look, but Mark was no longer there. My parents were both home, and when I came in the door, they were immediately concerned. I told them, and my mom started crying while my dad was furious. He told us to stay in the house as he got in his car and drove back to the field. He came back 10 minutes later and told my mom he didn't find the man. Instead, my parents got on the phone with the police and reported him, and soon after, a cop came to our house and interviewed us. I think they must have conducted a search of the area and patrolled the park more regularly, but unfortunately that man was never caught. My parents forbid me to go back to the park, but they didn't even need to do that, as I would have stayed far away from that place anyway. That's really the end of the story. I ended up getting more than enough types of flowers and doing well on the project, so I guess it's kind of a happy ending. But I still think about that encounter from time to time, and it terrifies me to think what would have happened if I couldn't have gotten away. Story 2. Let me start by saying that I hadn't believed in the paranormal, and I guess I still don't. But something happened one day which I don't have a complete explanation for. To give some context, there's a city park not far from where I live. Almost no one ever goes there, and it's about a mile away, so sometimes I just walk there, though usually I drive, and then get out and walk. A lot of times I go there after work to relieve stress, and when this experience took place, my job was especially stressful. After getting home from work and decompressing a bit, I ate some leftovers in the fridge and then changed clothes and got in my car. When I got to the park, it was already like 6, meaning that I'd have about 2 hours of daylight left. The park had several amenities, including bathrooms, a playground with swing sets and playscapes, a covered area with picnic tables, those workout stations with boards detailing various exercises, as well as several trails. You know, kind of standard park stuff. I'd almost always just walk the trails, and that's what I did this time. The path I'd usually take went up a fairly large hill and then back down another side. It also went through a field and a bit of a foresty area. Overall, I'd usually spend about an hour and a half walking, and some of the views from the hill were really quite breathtaking. Because of the time of day, I'd also get to appreciate the sunset. Fast forward to when I was at the base of the hill. There were a few sets of wooden stairs on the particularly steep parts of the trail, and I was just coming up to the first one. When I was on the second or so step, I stopped, as I heard a very distinctive noise. It wasn't something I'd heard before, and somehow I knew it wasn't natural, or good. The best I can describe it is like someone was playing a note on a synthesizer, and then it got higher in pitch and sounded more like a human voice, before abruptly stopping. It wasn't super loud, and it was hard to tell where it was coming from. I looked all around me but couldn't see anything, even though the forest at this part wasn't particularly dense. I tried to decide how worried I was about hearing the noise, and ultimately I decided to keep going. In hindsight, I'm not sure exactly why, though maybe it was because it was an especially tough day at work, and I didn't want to have to cut my hike short. About 30 minutes later, I reached the top of the hill, while also admiring the evening sunlight filtering through the trees. I walked into the little clearing with the wooden observation deck thing on the western side of the mountain. I stood there for a moment, catching my breath and just taking in the sunset. There were also some informational signs that talked about the local wildlife, and I glanced at those briefly. What happened next caught me completely off guard. As I was just about to leave, I heard that sound again, though this time it was a lot louder and it sounded a lot closer. It seemed to come from somewhere right below me, like on the side of the hill. I tried looking down, but couldn't see anything. I hadn't really expected to hear that sound again, and now I had to get back down the hill to my car in the fading light. I started to freak out. There was no one else around, and I only saw like one family when I walked up, and they had been on the playground. I contemplated my options. It didn't seem like the sound had come from any part of the trail, but rather just somewhere in the forest on the side of the hill. I could either go back the way I just came, or take the other half of the loop down the other side of the hill. I opted to just double back, since there would be more light, and I also felt a bit better because I hadn't seen anything odd on my way up there. I didn't run, but quickly and quietly started walking back the way I came. Now I was paranoid. I didn't hear that sound again, but every bird chirp and creature scurrying through the leaves kept me constantly on edge. I think I was halfway down the hill when I froze, and my entire existence seemed to shrink to a single point. About 50 feet in front of and below me on the trail, I saw it. The best way I can describe it was a tall, humanoid figure in a black robe. And when I say tall, I mean it. The figure looked to be about 8 or 9 feet tall. It was already starting to get dark, so I couldn't make out the finer details. I couldn't even tell if it was facing me or not. I would probably have referred to the figure as him, but something about it looked very off. Like, the person's torso looked a lot taller than their legs, and it was also very wide. Panic set in. Should I turn around and go back up the hill and try to go down the other side? That would mean I'd be hiking in much less light, and who's to say that thing wouldn't follow me over there? Should I try to cut through the forest and down the hill? It was rather steep in places and would likely take a lot longer to get down. Should I just walk up to and confront whoever, or whatever, that was? If I was panicking before, I almost lost it when the figure started to move. But thank God it wasn't coming towards me. Rather, it just walked off to one side of the trail and vanished from my view. I froze, and my mind moved a mile a minute as I once again tried to figure out what to do. I'm still not sure why, but I started running forward. I could almost see my life flash before my eyes as I came to the place where I had seen that figure. I could feel my body tighten up in anticipation of it popping out, but thank God again, it wasn't there. I kept running, further and further down the hill until I reached the base. I stopped for a moment and caught my breath. I looked back up at the hill in the fading light and didn't hear or see anything. I started running again, and 15 minutes later I was back in my car. As I started to pull out of the lot, I did one last scan. I still didn't see that figure, though I did notice one other car in the lot, which hadn't been there when I got there. I regrouped at home, my heart still pounding. I tried to logically process what had just happened, but it felt like my mind couldn't do it. I kept replaying everything in my head as I sat on my couch. After half an hour it was like 9, and I decided to get ready for bed and watch a few things on YouTube. I eventually fell asleep, and work the next day wasn't too bad. It was also a Friday, so that helped. Looking back, I think the figure I saw had to be a person. Maybe they were freakishly tall, or maybe they were wearing some kind of costume and trying to pull a prank on unsuspecting hikers. There was that other car in the parking lot when I left, and it was rather unusual for someone else to be there that late. As far as the noise, while I can't really describe what it sounded like, someone could have just made it with a computer or an instrument and then played a recording of it. After the fact, I realized that I didn't actually hear the noise at the same time I saw the figure, but in my mind they had to be connected. Logically, I don't think what I saw and heard that day was paranormal, but deep down, I can't shake the feeling that it was. Story 3. This story takes place a few years ago at a small neighborhood park, when my family and I went to visit one of my friends during the summer. Part of what makes this story harrowing is the fact that what happened was totally unexpected. It just goes to show that you never know exactly what's going to happen when you wake up each morning. For the purposes of this story, my wife will be Lauren, my son will be Luke, my daughter will be Aaron, and my friend will be Dan. Dan and I go way back as we went to high school and college together. Though we went into different industries, we still kept up with each other and some of our other friends. I don't want to share a lot of details, but I will say that Dan was very well off and owned a larger house, and was also the friendliest guy you'd ever meet. So when I mentioned to Dan that my family and I were planning to take a road trip to Disney World, and that our route would take us pretty close to where he lived, he wouldn't take no for an answer when he asked if we wanted to stop by. Based on the scheduling of our trip, we decided to stop by Dan's house on the way to Disney World. Dan also insisted that we stop back on the way back, but my wife acknowledged that our kids would likely be exhausted, and it would be best for us to drive straight back. Anyway, I'll skip over a lot of the details, but for immediate context, my family and I got to Dan's house at around 3 in the afternoon, and we were planning to leave the next morning around 9 and drive the rest of the way there. Though we weren't in the country by any means, the entrance to Dan's neighborhood was through a wooded area, and we saw a trail leading away from the road. When we pulled into Dan's driveway, he came out to greet us and hugged Luke and Aaron as they ran up to meet him. Aaron was 8 and Luke was 4, and they both remembered who he was. After bringing in some of our luggage to 2 of the guest rooms, Dan, my wife, and I started to catch up as the kids started playing on Dan's Xbox. Eventually we decided to order pizzas, as my wife and I didn't want to drag the kids to a restaurant since they'd been in the car all day. While we were eating, I asked Dan about the woodsy area we drove through, and he told us there was a huge green belt that ran along the outskirts of the neighborhood. He also said there were miles of hiking trails, and he thought they connected up to a few other neighborhoods. Luke, who was already somewhat of an outdoorsman, really wanted to go. It was only like 5, so there was plenty of sunlight left, and the weather was very pleasant. I decided to take Luke on the trails, and Dan equipped us with a backpack, water bottles, and snacks. Aaron stayed behind with Dan and my wife to watch a movie. Luke and I walked back to the trailhead near the entrance, and when we got there, we saw a sign with a map. Dan wasn't lying. The wooded area was pretty massive, and there were indeed miles of trails. We planned out our route for a minute, and ultimately decided to go on kind of a loop, which apparently had a playground on it. Of course, Luke was even more excited, and I had to keep up with him as we practically ran all the way there. It was probably a good mile or so through a woodsy area, but it was mostly on level ground, and the trail didn't have a lot of rocks or roots on it. Eventually a metallic structure came into view, and the trail opened up into a little clearing. This was a pretty small park by any standards, but it included 2 swings, monkey bars, a seesaw, 2 picnic tables, and a little lending library. Therefore it kept Luke entertained for a bit. After trying out the equipment, we took a look at the lending library. There were a few kids' books, along with a few adult books, including some romance novels, and ultimately Luke wasn't interested in any of them. So we sat down at one of the picnic tables and took out the water and snacks. While eating, I heard another voice and looked around. I was expecting another parent with their kid, but it actually sounded like an older woman. When she came into view, I noticed that she was alone, and I didn't see her holding a phone or earbuds, so it seemed like she was just talking to herself. I was a bit surprised, but I wasn't completely weirded out yet. In fact, I like to think out loud too sometimes, though admittedly probably not to that extent. I think the woman stopped talking when she noticed us, but a moment later she greeted us enthusiastically and began walking over. I found it odd how quickly she was walking in our direction, and instead of sitting at the picnic table next to us, she took a seat at ours. My son actually seemed a bit afraid, and in hindsight, that was probably a good instinct. She introduced herself as Judith and stuck out her hand. I shook it, and immediately afterwards she gave Luke a high five. After a bit of hesitation he returned it, but then Judith did like 5 more variations, including to each side and down low. That was fairly off-putting, I thought, and I could tell there was probably something wrong with her. After the introduction, she started making small talk, including asking for our names, what Luke thought of the park, and if we came here often. I figured she was probably from one of the surrounding neighborhoods, and though I would have preferred the conversation to have ended, I went along with it. However, she quickly and unexpectedly moved to the subject of politics. Now, I don't want to share a lot of details, mostly because I don't want this story to get political, and also because I tend to keep my views to myself. Suffice it to say that she asked what I thought of a particular candidate. Now maybe it was because I was starting to get annoyed, or because I thought that if she didn't like my answer that she'd leave us alone, but I gave her a direct answer. Boy, do I wish I hadn't. Immediately Judith got up and stood over us, gesturing with her hands and asking me how I could feel that way. Before we could even move, she started rattling off details, like things that had been said during their campaign, and told me that if they succeeded, that we'd all be in mortal danger. I tried asking her politely to give us some space, but when she didn't acknowledge what I was saying, I stood up and got between her and Luke. Judith didn't step back, and so we were literally right in each other's faces. I raised my voice a little and told her to leave us alone. She wouldn't take a hint, and now it seemed like the only 2 options would be to either get physical or leave. Because this woman was clearly unhinged and Luke was with me, and also partly because we didn't know these neighborhoods, I settled on the latter. At this point, Luke was close to crying, and I motioned for him to get up and follow me. I kept my face right up against Judith's, and when Luke was about 5 feet away, I started to back up. She started yelling louder, but at least she stayed put for a while. Luke and I made our way back to where our trail had led into the park, and all the while I made eye contact with Judith. To my horror, when we were almost out of sight, she came walking quickly over to us again. Now I had 2 more options. I could confront her again, possibly getting physical, or we could just start running away. I was torn, but when Luke started running, I ran with him. Luckily, we seemed to outrun Judith easily, or at least we thought. I periodically checked behind us and didn't see her at any point. Her voice also faded pretty quickly after we started running, and I didn't hear it again after that. We got back to Dan's house around 30 minutes later, and when Dan and my wife realized we were out of breath, they became concerned. I told them about what just happened, and Lauren almost started crying. Dan, being the gracious host that he was, started apologizing profusely. I assured him that what happened was in no way his fault. Dan told us that while he frequented the trails, he'd only gone to the park a handful of times, and he'd never seen or heard of that lady. Lauren considered the idea of us leaving Dan's house, driving for a while, and then staying at another hotel, but both kids protested immediately. Dan also assured us that we were safe, and promised to make sure all the doors were locked. He told us to wake him up if we noticed anything suspicious. Man, do I wish the story ended there, but unfortunately it did not. And though the next part may sound unbelievable, it was indeed our experience. The kids went to sleep around 8, as they passed out early due to all the excitement of the day. Dan, Lauren, and I stayed up a bit to catch up, and we each went to bed around 10:30. Lauren and I were pretty tired as well. Things went well for the first part of the night, but at 2 a.m. I heard a noise. I was the first one to wake up, and it took me a moment to get my bearings and remember I wasn't actually in my own bed. The sound was a knocking and seemed to be coming from the front door. My blood ran cold as I heard that same familiar voice. It was Judith, and she was yelling and rambling exactly as before. I woke up Lauren, and she started freaking out, and we went over and woke Dan up. In contrast to Dan's usually happy-go-lucky demeanor, he was now extremely upset, and honestly, it was a bit scary to see him like that. He picked up the baseball bat that he apparently had placed beside his bed and walked quickly to the door, yelling along the way to F off immediately. Our fears came true when Judith didn't even seem to acknowledge what Dan just said, all the while continuing to bang on the front door. At least she didn't use the doorbell and wake up the kids, though perhaps she just didn't think to use it. Dan yelled a few more obscenities from the other side of the door before he told the woman he was going to call the cops. After Judith still didn't respond to what Dan said, he indeed called the cops. When they showed up 5 minutes later, I kid you not, Judith was still there yelling and banging on the door. We heard the cops park, walk up to Dan's porch, and try to calm the lady down. It sounded like she turned to face them and continued yelling in their direction. 30 seconds passed, and we heard a scuffle, followed by Judith yelling, this time in pain, before finally lowering her voice. Eventually, we opened the door and the cops had Judith in cuffs. However, what shocked us was the fact that she had been carrying a large kitchen knife. In what seemed like the first time ever, Judith wasn't saying anything, but the look she was giving me, my wife and Dan, was completely disturbing. There's not much to say after that. The cops took Judith away and Dan pressed charges, and she ended up going to a mental institution. When our kids woke up later that morning, Lauren and I agreed not to mention what happened during the night. Save for Lauren and I losing a bit of sleep that night and being a bit tired the next day, the rest of our vacation went as planned. After a few months, Dan and I got to a place where we could joke about what happened, though Lauren never felt that way. Not that I blame her. I still think about that experience as being one of the scariest and strangest in my entire life, and I'm just glad that neither Luke nor Aaron came to any harm.